Ron Mark.
Chairman. In rising, I have to say that having listened to David Seymour's earlier speech, one can't help but empathise with some of the comments and observations he's made. And in fact, the comment to Mr. Chairman that there are risks in life in general that we face daily, I think is very pertinent, and it's something that we've often dwelt on, and how far do we go with legislation to try and curb risks, and what are the consequences, what are the economic consequences of that to our ratepayers and to our taxpayers. I often wonder if we were trying to build roads today for the very first time, how would we, under our current occupational safety and health laws, view the notion that we would separate two vehicles careering towards each other at 120 kilometres an hour by a piece of white paint? But we do. We have a piece of white paint on the road that supposedly is going to stop these two vehicles careering into each other at a combined speed of up to 240 kilometres an hour. But we do. We rely on that piece of white paint, and we deem it acceptable that that piece of white paint is going to keep our road toll down. And I just say that, yeah, we probably wouldn't allow that to happen in this day and age, would we, under our current laws? So I think Mr. Seymour does bring a degree of rationality to the debate with his views, although not everyone's clearly going to agree with his SOP. But my job is to speak, Mr. Chair, to the SOP that I brought forward on behalf of New Zealand First, Supplementary Order Paper number 160. And I just want to restate, the Supplementary Order Paper does insert a new Clause 41C to redress significant tax disadvantages faced by commercial, industrial, retail and heritage property owners when looking to bring buildings above the earthquake-prone building threshold required by this bill. And it does strike me as quite interesting that the government would not support this SOP, which, you know, as chartered accountants like KPMG and others have said, and local government New Zealand has said, and property owners have said, brings some sense and consistency to the inland revenue when it comes to dealing with the tax deductibility of business costs. And we struggle a little bit here in New Zealand First, hearing daily how this government wants productivity, wants to encourage business, wants to minimise red tape, wants to minimise compliance costs on businesses, wants to ensure that earthquake-prone buildings are brought up to the new spec as quickly as possible, and that landlords who have a lot invested in these buildings are incentivised to do that. The only incentive I can see, Mr. Chairman, in the legislation without this SOP is a big stick. Closing down of buildings, forcing some landlords in places like the Wairarapa to boot their tenants out on the street if they do not have the money or the wherewithal to strengthen their buildings within the timeframes laid down. And what is interesting, Mr. Chairman, is that we've gotten to this point in this legislation where cross-party, we're all in agreement on this legislation. There have been some massive changes to this legislation to what was produced when it first was brought into the House. There have been some wonderful concessions made by the government, by the Select Committee, the government members on the Select Committee, and the opposition has moved also into that middle ground to a place where we have unanimity. But yet, on this simple issue of providing New Zealanders who invested their money in purchasing buildings and now have had the misfortune of finding that those buildings are not going to be compliant with this piece of legislation that we're going to pass, are being told by the IRD that when they so move to be compliant, they will have added to the value of their building. They won't have added one shred, not 1 cent to the value of their building. They will have simply repaired it to the standard required by this Parliament. Repaired it, not improved it, not expanded its ability, its capacity or its capability. They will simply have repaired it to the standard that we are now saying in this legislation here tonight that they must do. So why would we allow IRD, in a rather narrow view, to not allow these people to treat those improvements as repairs and maintenance, and thereby accrue the tax deductibility concessions that I believe, Mr. Chair, Mr Chair.
Ron Mark.
That we in New Zealand First believe, and we are grateful for the support of the Green Party and Labour and I think from Mr Seymour from ACT, that our view is the right view. And I seriously would like to hope, I think that before the end of tonight, that some Cabinet Ministers might have a quick chit-chat upstairs and have a think about it. Because why would we need to wait for another piece of legislation to come through the House? Why would we need to put this off, vote this down, in the hope that in the never never, somewhere along the line, in some tax review, we readjust? And in the meantime, we have a whole bunch of people out there, and I can pick a few examples. We are very keen to preserve the fabric and the culture and the aesthetic appeal of many of our rural towns by making sure heritage buildings are looked after. And we've made these concessions here. But not all of the buildings we're talking about that have high character value are considered heritage buildings. So what are we going to see? For many of these landlords, it might well just be easier to run a bulldozer straight through the damn building, and there goes like a cinema in Masterton, which actually has typical rural appeal, high aesthetic value to that community. But if it turns out that the costs and the lack of any tax concessions make it easier for this owner to just simply say, well, I tell you, we'll knock it down and we'll build a single-storey building, you know, get a Skyline garage in and run our business out of that. That will add nothing to the cultural aesthetic appeal of Masterton's Queen Street. Or, for example, I can think of cinemas. What was the other one I thought of? You've got old pubs. All over New Zealand and rural provincial New Zealand, you have some old pubs. They are not considered heritage buildings. Mr Chairman, I would just hope that the government reconsider its earlier statement. This bill deals with an issue where, quite frankly, we think IRD is out of control. Quite frankly, we think that this concession is an easy one to make for the government. It does incentivise property owners to actually get on with the task of rebuilding. If it saves them a few dollars and encourages them to get stuck into the task earlier, if it actually saves them enough money to make it worth their while doing that building and not knocking it over, then why wouldn't we do it? We know that we need some sanity injected into the way in which IRD is interpreting the Act. We know that we need to give them some guidance. We think that the Income Tax Act of 2007 does need adjustment, and we would ask that the Minister seriously consider and support this legislation. And I know for one, Mr Speaker, local government New Zealand, property owners throughout New Zealand, accountants throughout New Zealand would think that this government has made this evening a very wise choice and a wise decision. Failing that, we don't want to hear anything more about the government and about how they're encouraging, how they want to see tax cuts for businesses, how they want to see concessions made to businesses and to property owners so that they can do the right thing. Because without them voting for this SOP, which is a very simple one, all of those words are quite hollow, Mr Chairman.
Call Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. I would like to